Last week, we learned why you bike the Outer Hebrides from south to north, and why there are such good people out there that help people that do it the wrong way. This week, we're back to the easy life. Now, once again, don't freak out when you see that 118 miles. Less than 30 of those were on the bike, since the first part of the day was another long ferry ride. We left the hostel before dawn, went down the hill about a half-mile to the dock, and waited for them to let us on board. Then we managed to snag the primo table in the lounge. This was a longer ferry ride than the trip out to Stornoway had been, so it was afternoon when we finally reached Oban, and the boat lifted its jaw to spit us all out. One thing about this trip, we saw ferries do things that they don't do back in Seattle. Oban was pretty, but we only had time for a quick stop at a bike shop for advice about our route. They recommended the longer way to Kilmartin, but we were worried about running out of daylight. So Carol volunteered to take the bus instead and carry our panniers. Thus lightened, Jeff and I would be able to bike there in the remaining daylight. Once we had Carol on the bus, Jeff and I headed down the busier road, although we had to stop first and fix Jeff's shifter. Remember when I said I had a package of spare screws and bolts? This is where that finally came in handy. Although the road was busy getting out of Oban, away from there it was lovely and quiet. Not to mention, pretty hilly. Meanwhile, Carol got to see the country from the bus and some of the hills that Jeff and I were enjoying. Of course, we all got to the lovely Kilmartin Hotel way before dark. Our rooms were superb, and the dinner that evening was exceptional. It was truly one of the best meals that we had on this trip. The route from Kilmartin to Stonefield Castle the next day was almost fairyland perfect. Since we had so few miles to ride today, after breakfast we looked at the tombstones in the church and then toured the museum. When we finally left Kilmartin, we had a few miles of a quiet road before we got to this path along a canal. It was obviously originally the tow path for animals pulling boats. While the path was now used by cyclists, the canal was used by pleasure boats. The boats enter the lock, they close the door, they pump the lock full of water to raise the boat up, and then it proceeds to the next section. In this way, it can go uphill as it works its way south, and then it goes downhill by reversing the process, eventually exiting at Loch Fyne. When we got to Loch Fyne at Ardrishaig, we got off in search of second breakfast. Thus fueled, we continued south along the shore, up and over a few punchy hills, to our lodging for the evening, Stonefield Castle. The castle was, of course, beautiful, and we had an excellent dinner there that night. Delicious local oysters, and Carol tried the Cullen skink soup. Our ferry to Islay the next day didn't depart until 1 p.m. So since I got up a little early, I walked around the castle grounds for a bit. They were extensive, and in the early morning, very lovely. Once again, today our route was split by a ferry ride. First, we would go about 2 miles to Tarvet for lunch, and then go another 6 miles to the ferry in Kennacraig to Islay. After that 2-hour ferry ride, we had plenty of daylight to ride from Port Ascaig down to Port Charlotte, about 15 miles. We liked Tarbert so much that we decided we would stay there after going to Islay and before going on to Oban. After a quick lunch and a fast ride south, we got to the ferry with plenty of time. The ferry had a special locker just for our bikes, plus this really cool moving double-decker car platform, something you don't see in Seattle. The passenger area was swanky too. Since the weather was so nice, we weren't worried about them canceling the ferry, and the ride was fast and smooth. On Islay, the first few miles of the route were hilly, but once we reached the water, everything was beautiful. We got to where we were staying for the next 2 nights, the Port Charlotte hostel, a little before check-in time, but they let us in and I soon had dinner cooking in their well-appointed kitchen. This was our second day off on this tour, so theoretically nobody had to go anywhere today. In reality, however, Jeff's shifter still wasn't working right, so he and I went to Bowmore looking for a mechanic.
Hello?
We eventually found one who was able to fix the issue. Jeff headed back to Port Charlotte, and I went off exploring. I ran into Carol here in Port Ellen, and she recommended a good food truck for lunch. Then I continued up the shore, where I found this excellent multi-use path. Next thing that I knew, I was here. I looked around and bought a few things, and then started back. When I was almost back to Port Charlotte, I opted to go up into the hills for a bit. Next thing that I knew, I was here. I looked around and bought a few things, and then headed for Port Charlotte. I got back to the hostel with plenty of time to clean and lube our bikes, during which I finally had to battle with the midges. Then we all went out to dinner at a nearby pub. During dinner, I found out that Jeff had walked over to the Kilchoman distillery himself. I'll let Carol tell you about her day.
So while Robert and Jeff were off exploring and getting Jeff's bicycle fixed, I went to the couple that ran the hostel that we stayed at in Port Charlotte and asked them where it might be a good idea for me to explore. They referred me to a multi-use trail that went from Port Charlotte to the next town, about 2 miles long, and they said once I got there I could take a bus from that town over to Port Ellen, which was on the other side of an inlet. So I set off from the hostel and walked along the trail. The weather was gorgeous, the water was to my right, the road to my left was pretty empty. I saw the guys go by and had the opportunity to wave at them. I did go by a repair stand like the one we saw in Stornoway, as with the other one we couldn't figure out how to open it up to get in so that you can inflate your tires. All over Scotland I saw many monuments to the First World War and Second World War soldiers who had died. I then ended up in the town, whose name I can't pronounce, at the distillery where I was due to catch my bus. When I got into Port Ellen, I noticed that all the homes along the water had these rock formations next to the walkway that went into their front door. This one contained a plaque, and it said that it was an American monument to American troops that drowned, and it was a thank you. I went by a food truck and had an excellent lunch, and that's where I ran into Robert, and he and I sat there together on the bench just enjoying the beautiful seashore and marina and eating our lunch. After I got off the bus and was walking 2 miles back, I ran into Jeff again, who was coming back from getting his bicycle fixed. He and I went down on the beach and just explored some tide pools and enjoyed playing in the water. I also saw plenty of livestock along the way, cows, pigs, and sheep. And finally, back at the youth hostel for the night, we had a wonderful dinner and just a great chance to relax and watch the sunset.
Next week, we return to the ancestral homeland, Arran. See you then.